In a quiet town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, there was a sense of peace and tranquility that enveloped the community. The streets were lined with charming houses, each with its own story to tell. But at the end of Sycamore Street, there stood an old, abandoned house that seemed out of place. Its windows were dark and lifeless, and the paint was peeling off in large patches, giving it a haunting appearance. No one dared to go near it, especially at night. The house had an aura of dread that repelled even the bravest souls. It had been empty for decades, ever since the Dawson family mysteriously disappeared one night, leaving the town in shock and sorrow. The headlines screamed of the tragedy, but no answers were ever found. They left behind only uneaten dinner and an unlocked front door, as if they had been interrupted in the middle of their evening routine. The scene was eerie, frozen in time, and it haunted the memories of those who remembered the family. One evening, a group of curious teenagers, driven by a mix of boredom and bravado, decided to explore the house on a dare. They had heard the stories, but their youthful curiosity got the better of them. Armed with flashlights and nervous laughter, they crept up the creaking steps and into the house. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned under their weight, adding to the sense of foreboding. The air inside was thick and musty, as if time had stopped the night the Dawsons vanished. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the smell of decay was overpowering. Dust-covered furniture sat undisturbed, and a faded family portrait hung crookedly on the wall. The eyes in the portrait seemed to follow them as they moved, adding to their unease. As they wandered from room to room, they found nothing unusual, just a house frozen in time. The silence was deafening, and every creak and groan of the house made their hearts race. But when they reached the attic, everything changed. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread washed over them. At the far end of the attic, in the dim glow of their flashlights, they noticed something strange. A mirror, tall and covered with a heavy, moth-eaten cloth. It seemed out of place, almost as if it had been hidden away deliberately. One of the boys, grinning to hide his fear, pulled the cloth off. The mirror's surface was tarnished, but it reflected the room perfectly, except for one detail. The mirror reflected the room perfectly, except for one detail. In the reflection, there was a figure standing behind them. In the reflection, there was a figure standing behind them. They spun around, their hearts pounding, but when they looked, there was no one there, I know. But when they spun around, there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the dust and shadows. Nervously, they checked the mirror again, and the figure was still there, closer this time. It was as if the shadow was moving towards them through the reflection. A tall, shadowy silhouette, featureless but with a looming presence. It seemed to absorb the light around it, making it even more menacing. Panic set in, and they backed away from the mirror. But one of the girls, Sarah, couldn't take her eyes off of it. She was transfixed, as if in a trance. The shadow in the reflection was reaching out, its hand almost touching her shoulder. The air grew colder, and a sense of impending doom filled the room. Suddenly the mirror cracked. The sound was deafening, like a gunshot, and it echoed through the attic. A chilling, inhuman whisper filled the room, and the attic door slammed shut on its own. The whisper seemed to come from all around them, and it sent shivers down their spines. The temperature dropped, and their breath became visible in the frigid air. It was as if the very essence of the house was trying to freeze them out. They banged on the door, screaming for help, but no one outside could hear them. The house seemed to have swallowed their cries, trapping them in its cold embrace. Then Sarah let out a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound of pure terror, and it echoed through the house, making their blood run cold. The shadow had stepped out of the mirror. It was no longer just a reflection, it was a tangible presence in the room. It didn't walk or crawl, it simply glided across the floor toward her. Its movements were unnatural, almost otherworldly. The others tried to pull her away, but the shadow reached for her arm. Its touch was cold and unyielding, like the grip of death itself. The moment it touched her, Sarah froze, her eyes wide and lifeless. It was as if her very soul had been drained from her body. The door to the attic finally burst open, and the others fled, dragging Sarah's limp body behind them. They didn't stop until they were far away from the house, their hearts pounding in their chests. They never spoke of what happened that night, but one thing was clear. Sarah was never the same. She was a shell of her former self, haunted by the events of that night. She sat quietly, staring into nothing, as if her soul had been left behind in that house. Her friends watched her with a mix of sorrow and fear, knowing that they had lost a part of her forever. And every time they passed by the mirror in the attic, they swore they could still see the shadow watching, waiting for someone else to look into its depths. The house remained a silent sentinel, guarding its dark secrets. Waiting for someone else to look into its depths, the legend of the Dawson house grew, and it became a place of whispered tales and fearful glances, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of their quiet town.